Notice in the Casio calculator I've entered the temperature and cricket chirps data that you were given on Friday. I want to walk you through the process of doing a regression calculation and then viewing the regression or trend line along with the data to get a visual on the relationship between those two variables and their model, that's the trend line. So to begin with, we're going to press the Calc key. And before we continue, we want to verify that the lists that we've chosen are correctly entered in our regression calculation. Remember that on Friday we decided that temperature would be our independent variable, or our X list, and that cricket chirps per second would be our dependent variable and our Y list. We made that decision because we believe that cricket chirps are dependent on the temperature and not the other way around. So we know that we want list 1 to be our X list and list 2 to be our Y list. So we'll press the Set key and verify that those lists are correctly set in our regression calculation. Notice that X list for one variable statistics is list 1. That is correct. We always want to have frequency set to 1. For our two variable X list, we want list 1. And for our two variable Y list, we want list 2. Suppose we wanted to change that, we could press the list key and then type the list number that we wanted to use in our calculation. Of course, in this case, we've already determined that we want list 2, so I typed 2 in for that list and I press return on my computer keypad, and that verifies that all of the values are correctly set. Notice that the two variable frequency is also always going to be left 1. Now I'm going to press the escape key on my computer keypad. Next, I'm going to press the REG key, that stands for regression, and then I'm going to press the X key, which identifies linear regression. Lastly, we're going to press the AX plus B key because we want our regression values reported in slope-intercept form. So when I press the AX plus B key, notice that it takes us to a screen that reports our regression values. A is our rate of change or slope for our regression equation, and B is the y-intercept for our regression equation. Notice in the lower left we're reporting these values where A is the coefficient on X, our temperature, and B is the constant in our slope-intercept form of a linear equation. So that gives us the values that we need in order to plot a line that would most effectively capture the relationship between our temperature and number of cricket chirps per second. I want to quickly make sure that you know how to interpret the rate of change or slope for our trend line, and B, the y-intercept. A, our slope, tells us that for each 1 degree increase in temperature, we would expect a 0.2 chirps per second increase in our dependent variable cricket chirps per second. Our B value tells us that when the independent variable is 0, or when temperature is 0, we would expect that the number of cricket chirps per second is about 0.46. So at 0 degree temperature, we would expect about 0.46 cricket chirps per second. Okay. So lastly, in this regression analysis, we want to look carefully at our R value. Remember that R describes the strength of the relationship between the two variables. So notice that R is near 1, and that tells us that the strength of this relationship is relatively strong. Remember from previous discussions that an R value of 1 is a perfect linear relationship, and an R value of 0 shows absolutely no relationship at all, no correlation between the two variables. So since our R, our regression coefficient, is near 1, 0.83, we expect a strong correlation between the variables, and that would tell us that the data that's plotted from our X-list and Y-list should be fairly close to our trend line. Shouldn't be a lot of variation. Real quickly, remember that R values between about 0.7 and 1 are strong. Between 0.7 and 0.5 are moderately strong. Below 0.5, I would describe those as moderately weak to weak. And so now we can move on, and I want to plot the data from our regression line along with the data from our data sets. So I've written down these values for A and B, and then we're going to back out by pressing escape once, twice, 3, 4 times until we get back to our original screen. And now I'm going to press the graph key. Before I continue, I want to make sure that the lists are correctly set. We're working with graph 1, which is this first option here. Notice that we're going to graph a scatter plot. That describes our data plot. We want to use list 1 as our X list and list 2 as our Y list. Those are all correctly set. You can set the mark type to be used in plotting the data in this option, and I'm going to change that just so you see how that works. Press the return key, and now we're back to where we began the set operation. Next, I'm going to press the graph key, and that will plot our data set. I want to plot that regression or trend line along with the data from our data set. So I'm going to press this DEFG key, which stands for Define Graph. It takes me to a graph menu, and in here I'm going to enter the values for our regression equation or trend line. The Y values are already listed, so I'm going to press 0.20, and then the X key has to be chosen from your calculator keypad, not your computer keypad. You must use the calculator keypad to enter the X. Then since our B value was positive, I'm going to add the plus key, 0.46, and that gives us our y-intercept. Now you must press the return key in order for that equation to be saved. Next, we can press the draw key, and that will draw our data set values, our scatter plot from our data set, along with the trend line together. Notice that the trend line appears to capture the variation in the data from our data set. So that shows us that we have a fairly strong relationship between the data in our data set, our temperature and cricket chirps.